Good evening, everyone. I know there's a couple more people signing in. These are just introductory remarks, and then we'll get to it. There should be chairs around, so please pull up a chair to the table or join a free spot right now. But my name is Erin Zwerko. I'm the Director of Planning and Development for the town of Yarmouth. Welcome tonight to the Community Conversation on Housing. Thank you so much for joining our Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee, the Department of Planning and Development, and our consultants, North Star Planning. Ben is over here in the red. Jamal is seated at one of the tables, and Jeff Levine of Levine Planning Strategies for the first in the series of community conversations that will help shape the Yarmouth Comprehensive Plan update. If you're not familiar with comprehensive planning, a comprehensive plan is a document with a long-range view that guides municipal policy, growth, and investment over the next 10 to 20 years. The planning process incorporates a community vision and values, along with the latest data on topics such as housing, transportation, recreation, economy, historic resources, and fiscal health. Our last comprehensive plan was adopted in 2010, so it's time to move on to an updated document. Tonight, we're here to dive deeper into housing, including the state of housing in Yarmouth, the market, and the spectrum of housing affordability. While we're here to discuss housing specifically, we cannot just consider this topic in a vacuum. There are many other elements integrated into the discussion, such as transportation, fiscal policy, zoning and land use, among others. The feedback that we'll receive from tonight's event will help the department, our consultants, and the steering committee narrow in on those high-level goals that we can then develop strategies and actions to address. So following a presentation from Jeff Levine and a brief Q&A, you've already divided yourself up into tables, thank you very much, but we'll do guided table conversations and activities for about 45 minutes. The goal of the series of activities is to have all of you consider how we should meet Yarmouth's housing needs, get a sense of local vision and values and priorities for housing. There are reference materials at each table, and there are also some large format maps over on the Route 1 side of the room that are taken from the draft inventory chapters that you can view for reference, or feel free to actually take it off the easel and bring it to your table if you need to. At the completion of the table activities, we will reconvene and ask each table to report out regarding their findings. I'll also note that in the front near the snacks and the beverages, we do have our vision statement printed out on a big board. Please tell us what you would add to it by taking a sticky note from the table next to it and just sticking it right on there, or stick it on the big sticky note that's on the table there. So if you have fun tonight, please consider joining us next Monday to discuss economy, and on October 2nd to discuss the environment and natural resources, all of which will lead up to the future land use workshop on November 13th. If you aren't able to attend the upcoming events, please consider joining the discussion online at planyarmouth.com. That's all one word. You can also get there linked from the town's website. Each of our events will be adapted for an online participation. And then finally, thank you to Patriot Insurance for allowing us to hold these community conversations in this great meeting space. We definitely appreciate it so much. And then just some logistical items. Through the double doors at the rear of the room are restrooms. And like I said, please help yourself to any snacks or beverages up in the front. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Jeff for the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, great. Thanks so much for that good overview. I'm going to go through some information. But first off, I want to say I'm really impressed with the Girl Scout cookies. Whoever brought those, it's the first. I've gone to a lot of these meetings in my career. I think it's the first time there's been cookies that good. Thank you. That was awesome. So let's see. A lot of this Erin already covered, but I'm going to do the presentation, and she mentioned a lot of the schedule and the update and where we're going with this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. Just briefly, in terms of the consulting team, North Star Planning is the lead. I'm working with them on housing elements. There are a couple of other subs. There's 3 other subs working with North Star on other pieces of the plan. And it's really exciting. It's a fun process. We enjoy doing these kinds of processes. I hope you have some fun tonight in addition to helping us learn about the community. Oops. So let's talk about housing. A couple of housing highlights, and this is just sort of, I'll circle back to some of these a little later. In 2021, about 3/4 of the housing in Yarmouth is owner-occupied, and about 1/4 of it's rental housing. That's actually up a little bit on the owner-occupied side since 2010, but not so much that I would necessarily call it a big trend. Just something to keep an eye on. But certainly it seems like the direction right now seems to be towards owner-occupied housing. But again, it's not a big enough shift to really know for sure. And this is a big thing you'll see in a later slide. The bulk of the housing in this town was built between 1960 and 2000. I think 60% of it roughly. So that was obviously a time, if those of you who were here then remember, a lot of housing being built. Since then, not as much. As of last year, the median housing price was $815,000. That's a doubling since 2010. And again, obviously, you can control for things like inflation and all sorts of factors. So doubling isn't necessarily a true doubling. But the fact is that housing is getting more expensive in Yarmouth more quickly than it is in the region as a whole. It's also true that when you look at the zoning ordinance right now, it does sort of direct development towards relatively low-scale single-family homes. There's obviously exceptions in the town, and there's good reasons for doing that in some parts of the town. But that's just sort of an objective analysis when you look at the zoning. A lot of single-family zones with relatively large lot sizes. Telling data, 84% of the households in Yarmouth can't afford the median home sale price. So oftentimes that's because somebody bought a house a while ago, or is very stretched, or some of both. They may have wealth, which sort of only secondarily shows up as income, but a lot of times people are struggling to afford moving to Yarmouth, and that's something that has gotten worse in the last 20 years, as I think many of you know. The numbers are lower for the county and for the state, although still pretty high. I think we all know that this is a statewide issue, not a Yarmouth alone issue. And interestingly, those earning twice the median income still struggle to buy a home in Yarmouth. So that's just something to think about. In terms of the type of housing, this is really the same data shown in two different ways. And again, it shows that majority of the housing is single-family detached. There's been a pretty big growth in single-family attached homes, townhomes, things like that, which is an interesting development. Again, it's too hard to say exactly what that means, but it's an interesting sort of model for maybe doing some sort of multifamily or more efficient housing in a way that maybe fits in with the community. Small but significant number of singles, 2s, and 3, 4 units. And then as you get towards multifamily, obviously, it becomes less common. Still some, not as much as in some other communities. And then a fairly small number of mobile homes. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but you can see the big bubble in the middle here, the 1960 to 2000. And then, in 2000 is when a lot of the growth management work started happening in the state, and Yarmouth, along with many other communities, started restricting housing more than they had. And obviously, you can see the results. The housing stock, less than 10% of it has been built since then. And that wouldn't necessarily be, in and of itself, a challenge. On the other hand, there's clearly affordability challenges, and those are at least somewhat related to housing supply. When you look at affordability, and again, this is what I touched on earlier, you look at the percentage of households that aren't able to afford the median home. And this is generally the people that are already here. So how can they afford it if 84% of them, shouldn't be able to afford it? Again, they may have bought the house 10, 20, 30 years ago. They may be struggling. They may have decided they're going to really focus on housing. They really want to be in Yarmouth. It's a very desirable community to be in. And then sometimes they may have wealth that's not showing up in income, but a lot of times wealth does show up in income because most wealth produces income, and so that does show up as part of your income. It's not entirely invisible. These are a little small, but just the same chart for renters and for homeowners. Generally, when we talk about housing affordability, the general back of the envelope is similar to when you qualify for a mortgage, that you shouldn't be spending more than roughly 30% of your income on housing. And now, obviously, people can spend more than that, but when you do start to both sacrifice some of the other things you might normally do, and you also are more at risk of foreclosure or not being able to pay your rent. It just gets tighter. So there's nothing magical about 30%. it's just an observational value that over time people have noticed that when households spend more than 30%, they struggle. So you look at the number of households or the percentage of households that are spending more than 30% of their income on housing, and what these charts do is break it out by, on the bottom, the various income levels in the community. So it's sort of a cross-section between the percentage of population that are what we call housing burdened, spending more than 30% of their housing, income on housing, versus income levels. And not surprisingly, as the income goes up, it's a smaller percentage of the people, of the households that are struggling. So on the renter side, you see at $10,000 to $19,000 dollars per year, every single one of those households is paying more than 30% of their income on housing. As you go up to the renters making $75,000 to $99,000, it's still a third of them, which is still a lot actually, given that income level. But it shows again the cost and also the desirability of the community. Similar patterns in home ownership, just sort of broken out a little differently, but really the same basic curve. It actually goes up a little bit and then it goes back down. My thought is that's probably because there is some affordable subsidized housing in the community that is often devoted to lower incomes. But sometimes it's also just noise when you're looking at a difference between, say, 90% and 100%. Looking at zoning again, these are a number of the zoning districts in the community, and when you look at what they require in order for you to build housing now, you look at minimum lot areas that go from 1 to 3 acres in many parts of the town. For 2 families, generally it's about double that. And then the amount of residential density you can have on an acre, 1 acre per unit, sometimes up to more than 1 acre per unit. But still, obviously, one of the limiting factors in the town is the zoning. Zoning can't tell you that you have to build. People often worry that if you loosen the zoning, suddenly everybody's going to build everything everywhere. And objectively, that actually doesn't happen. There's a lot of friction in the housing market. There's a lot of people who like their single-family home. They don't necessarily want to build out their lot more densely if they could. But what zoning can do is keep those opportunities from happening. So if there is an interest in having more housing, one of the tools that communities can look at that's basically free to the community is, does our zoning really match our vision for the community? And oftentimes you'll look at the vision statements in a comprehensive plan and you look at the zoning and there will be a mismatch. People want to keep their New England style, beautiful, walkable community, but then they read the zoning and say, but we can't build that here anymore. This is all non-conforming. So something to take a look at, and again, not a Yarmouth only thing. We've done some needs assessment work, and this is actually from Camoin Associates, one of the sub-consultants. What this chart looks at is, putting aside affordability, just what would the market expect to build in the next 5 to 10 years in Yarmouth. So, you look at the numbers on the renter side, and you have a baseline in the high growth scenario. Not a lot of sort of market demand in the absence of anything else for more rental housing. I think in part because, again, the high cost is limiting the market. Not quite as much in the for sale market. There's definitely some interest in building more in Yarmouth. You might be able to see about 50 units a year built, again, in the absence of any affordability restrictions, but not a huge amount based just, again, on the market as a whole. So what we did with that is we took sort of the next step and we said, how can we start to look at the market sort of broken down into other markets and thinking about affordability as part of the dynamic? So we started looking at the need for ownership units. We did the same thing with renter units on the next slide. So we looked at the owner cost as a percentage of household income in both Cumberland County and Yarmouth. This is sort of the opposite of the slide that showed 30% or more and what percentage is in that category. This is what percentage are people spending, household spending on their housing. And you'll see some of these numbers sort of replicated from other slides in certain ways. The 32.2% of households in Yarmouth that are spending 30% or more of their income on housing, so they're housing burdened. At a Cumberland County level, that number is more like 22%. So you do start to see some patterns. Interestingly, on the lower end, where people are spending less than 20% of their income on housing, Yarmouth's actually below the county. You can sort of back into this saying, okay, if all of these households were spending 30% of their income or less on housing, what price housing would they want to buy? It's a little bit of an artificial exercise because they're already here, but it is a way of saying, okay, what would be affordable to the people in this room, in this town, that are already here? And you'd see a lot of demand for housing at the 185,000 to 260,000 level. Wouldn't that be great? The 1990s call, they want their housing back. But not surprisingly, and just demand at a lot of different levels, even at over 500,000. So if you could even get the cost down a little bit, you would start making things more affordable. You don't have to solve this entire problem necessarily. Looking at rental units, similar charts, and you see that 51% of the renting households in Yarmouth are sort of spending more than 30% of their income in housing, are housing burdened, compared to about 43% in Cumberland County. You can still back those numbers into rents, same way you can back them into housing prices. And this is sort of interesting. You see a lot of demand going up to, say, $1,800, $1,900 a month, which is, not quite back to the 1990s. I mean, it's definitely below what rents are now, but it seems a little more achievable, potentially. And that seems to be the biggest area where there's need, again, among current residents in Yarmouth. And this is a market where people are more likely to move for a lower rent. When you're in a house, you're obviously usually pretty reluctant to move. You may not have the opportunity. You may want to be near the school you're near, things like that. The rental market's a little more fungible, and it really suggests that in that $1,200 to $1,800 range, there's a lot of demand, again, among current residents. The bottom line here is the need. Before we showed the need in the market with no factoring affordability. This analysis tries to factor in affordability, albeit imperfectly, and comes up with a much higher need, 835 for sale units and 443 rental units that are not currently in the market. There's some limits to this analysis. We used the best data we could, and it gives you a basic idea, but it's based on your current needs. It's based on the people that are currently living in Yarmouth. It's not based on an untapped demand of people who might move in. The other analysis by Camoin sort of suggests that, but it doesn't talk about affordability. It assumes that if owners and renters are two totally different markets. Now, we all know that's not entirely true, but again, it was hard to decide what makes someone buy versus rent and make too many assumptions, and we didn't want to go down that path of making too many assumptions. And it doesn't analyze what happens if some of those households actually move to those more affordable units, because the units they were in would become available. So there's a whole second level that might happen. Again, these are the best numbers we can come up with, but they're not necessarily the end-all and be-all. And then it also doesn't factor in the reality that there's certainly households that will move to a place like Yarmouth knowing they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing, either willing to chance it, or they have a great plan, they're only going to have one car, or they're going to drive their car for 25 years, or their uncle is wealthy, and if things get really bad, they can call him up. There are situations that are not factored in here, but you do have to make some generalizations. The last thing I'll say on this slide is these numbers seem really big, but when you think about these assumptions, you begin to realize that if you could even start to make a nick in this, if you could even start to produce 1 or 200 units on either side, you would start to affect things in a way that would be positive. Finally, I want to play a little bit of a game, and these are not my slides, but they're really fun. But before that, I think I'll pause. Are there any questions? Yes?
So where was this meeting come from?
Oh, we're recording this, so we want to get you a microphone.
Hi. My name is Alexa. Where does this data come from? Because I'm looking at these numbers and saying there are no homes available under 500,000 really. So you're talking about, and I'm in real estate for full disclosure, and I live here. So where is the data coming from, and why did you pick those price points?
Sure. So most of the data here comes from the U.S. Census and the American Community Survey. And if you look at the report online, it has the data citations. I believe I also used some recent sales from MLS. And just to clarify, I'm not saying those units are available. I'm saying there would be demand for them if they were available on that chart.
So 2021 census, I'm thinking?
Sometimes I use the 2021 ACS. I think that was the most useful. The reason I'm hedging is I can't quite remember if that was available when we did this analysis, but I think so.
I just have a couple of, questions. You talk about rental units, but what we didn't address in here was bedroom size. So when we assume house, I think you can assume most houses are 3. There are a few 2, and there are certainly bigger houses, and price tends to go along with that. But when you talk rental units and you're talking 1 bedroom versus 3 bedroom versus, I mean, that's a pretty significant number I would love to see talked about. The other thing is you had a chart a few slides back where you threw up some numbers that talked about percentage of income going towards housing, but you said in the slide previous to that the average or the median income in Yarmouth is $140,000 a year. I think you said somewhere around that, and the charts that you put up were all under 100,000. So just want to note, I guess, we're not even talking the median price points in that, and so that would be interesting data too. Thank you.
Sure, and you're right. We didn't break out by bedroom size. It's very hard to predict whether people feel they'd want a bigger place, whether they're, in some cases, overhoused if they're retired. So you're right. We didn't generally break it out by household size or by ideal bedroom mix in this analysis. And was there a second question, or was that an observation?
Do we have any data on the above the median income? This one here. Everything listed here is below the median income of Yarmouth.
That's correct. And the reason we did is that the number really started to drop off as you get above 100,000 for renters. There's 0% that are housing burdened, and only 10% for homeowners. So it just seemed
conflicts with what you just said on the other slide. So now I'm confused.
I'm sorry, which other slide?
Where we're housing burdened.
Oh, at the beginning.
Somewhere towards the end, but yes. Sorry.
We might need to address that after.
Yeah.
That's fine. Thank you.
Happy to talk with you more about that.
Yeah, that's great.
Just to put into perspective, could you cite how many households, how many owner-occupied homes there are in Yarmouth now, and how many rentals? I'm just saying, you say that we need 800 some odd houses. What percentage above and beyond what we already have is that?
Sure. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. They should be in the inventory sections as a proxy for that. You can assume a good percentage of the single-family detached homes are owner-occupied here. So it should give you a general order of magnitude.
We can share that at the end of the session. We'll get those numbers while people are at their tables.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, I think we have one or two more questions, right? I think you.
Let's take one more.
Okay.
This is more of a devil's advocate question. The data and the presentation of it, you're presenting demand, needs assessments, and the underlying assumption seems to be that what can we do, or that we should address this demand and these needs that we see. And what if that's not the community sentiment?
Sure, and certainly that is an option. What we're categorizing here are existing Yarmouth residents, people who are already in the community, and documenting how many of them are housing burdened. What the town decides to do with that data, to some extent, is part of this comprehensive planning process. If the decision is, well, people who are housing burdened, that's their problem. I mean, that's not necessarily my decision to make. I would suggest that, if people are already here, there might be some interest in keeping them here, but not necessarily. That's really up to the town. Okay.
You got a couple more things.
Yeah, one last thing, and then I'm happy to chat less formally. And I'm using this. I did not create this. I just really loved it. I think it came from the town originally. These are just to show that we all have in mind what we think of as multifamily or single-family homes. And we don't need to necessarily do this too publicly, but if you want to write down or think about, when you look at these 6 different buildings, how many units you think are in each of them? and it's a little hard to see, but you know, I think between the two slides you should be able to see. And since we want to get to the substance here, I'm just going to spoil the answer. You know, these are all buildings that have more than one housing unit in them. Number 5 is the closest to a single-family home. It has a single-family home with an accessory dwelling unit. Sorry, number 6 actually is a single-family home. And then, you know, you have 2 dwelling units, you have 3, and then on one of them you have 4 to 7, which I wouldn't have been able to guess. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it off, and happy to chat some more. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff. So you're, at each table, would the table facilitator raise their hand? We'll just make sure that every table has a facilitator, and everybody at the table knows who their facilitator is. So there's, we're going to take about 45 minutes, and there's a few activities that we'd like you to work on, a combination of individual activities and group activities. We'll take a little time at the end to kind of circle back on some of these things, and we will reserve a little bit of time for some additional Q&A. Jeff will be available during the session. I'll be walking around, so if you have individual questions or have things that you haven't had a chance to ask yet, you'll have an opportunity to do that. This microphone that I was handing around is not connected to the PA system. It's nothing wrong with you. This is the only one in the room that is. So this is important for the video recording. This is for the room. So that's an explanation. I guess at this point, I'd like to ask the table facilitators to go ahead and get started. And we'll be around as a resource, but you have your instructions and activities, so get to it. Thanks. All right. I can tell people are really engaged in this, and I do hate to interrupt the conversations, but we do only have the room for so long. So, did everybody? Was this fun? What was it? Was it easy? So. I think what I'd like to do is have the table facilitators for each table kind of come up just as you're coming to the front, and you can all come up at once. And we'll give folks maybe just a minute or two to kind of summarize the conversation that happened at their tables. So, Julie, do you want to get started? I think what we're going to ask for the table facilitators is really just to hit some of the highlights. You know, we're not going to hit every single thing that happened, but not everyone is as loud as I am. So if you could tone down the side conversation, we'll just have a quick report back. If we can do this fast enough, we will have a few minutes for some Q&A at the end, okay? Okay, thanks.
Okay, clap twice if you can hear me. All right, you're all doing A+. pluses. Excellent. Okay, so our table here did a wonderful job. Great example of civil discourse here. There was agreement around prioritizing transit-oriented development, focusing on the corridors like Route 1, Exit 15, Exit 17, where there's already infrastructure existing, where there's already residential development, conserving open space and being very sensitive to areas like the wetlands, the marshes, and then also in terms of the housing typologies, really focusing on what was missing, what was in Jeff's presentation. So larger 8+ units, also for 3 to 7, and particularly even for single-family homes, thinking about smaller families, single-family homes on smaller lot sizes that might increase affordability and also be able to be forms of infill. So that's a very quick synopsis. You all did a great job.
Thank you.
I ask you, is it fair to have a facilitator who is also on the town planning staff? Do the rest of us suffer because just as amateurs we're here? Well, most of our time we talked about the mix of housing and where we thought it would go. We put 30% towards senior/affordable housing. Oops, I'm leaning on that. All right. So we because I think we're all old over the table, at least some of us are, we put most of our 30% on senior and affordable housing, and when it came to the beans, we tended to put the beans about where the senior affordable housing is now. That seems to be a pretty good place to put it because it's relatively near the center. There is some walking available. Sidewalks are there and so on. We put 25% for 2-unit duplexes. So we saw a real market for the 2-unit duplexes that could be side by side, particularly for the younger families, because the cost per unit may be less. Building a slightly bigger building for 2 units might keep the cost down. 20% of our mix was for 3 to 7 units. Again, we're seeing the need for either housing or rental, because it could be either one. And we had a big discussion about townhouses and what they were. And we were thinking of no laughing over there. But in any case, we decided that was 3 to 7 units, or as close as we could get. So we had 20% for that and 20% for condos and other apartment, mixed-use commercial buildings. And I think, am I right that one of our models there was the new building along Route 1 near the big intersection. So we saw that as one. And we gave finally 5% to single-family housing. So we're well down on that. We didn't really come to agreement on the location of where the beans should go. Sorry. And as a consequence, we didn't get very far on the last task. So those of you who did, because of their facilitator, good luck to you. Thank you very much.
So to be really speedy, so our group spent a lot of our time talking about the mix of housing types. We definitely we didn't go as small in the single family houses, but we were below 20%. And then we looked at senior and affordable housing and multifamily housing and duplexes. I think that was the majority of the rest of our housing in a relatively even mix of those. And we had a lot of discussion about what that would mean. Our beans were fairly well dispersed with probably a majority, if you were to count them up, along Route 1, but they were dispersed throughout the whole town so that there wasn't any one particular location that had all the beans except for Freeport.
For our group on the housing mix, we kind of flipped the script, if you will, and So 80% of the housing we thought should be multifamily, condo, townhouse, everything but single family, with ADUs in that, and then about 20% single family. On the beans, we had a lot of fun with the beans. Most of them, I'd say, a majority of them were north or west of 295. So where all the density is now, we made it more dense, essentially, just because of infrastructure, obviously. And then the, what was the last? Implications. Oh, yes. And then the implications. We didn't spend a lot of time on that. It was more, I think what we thought the town needed. So we just jotted down a bunch of ideas in that way. So, yeah. Thanks.
Hey everybody, there appears to be some pretty good consensus in the room. Our group really focused on having more of an equitable spread between the different housing types, and really focusing on, again, those higher density units, focusing on sort of the senior and affordable, the 8+ units. We're at 20%. We did allocate 20% towards single family houses, but sort of within the context of reshaping what it means to have a single family house, and really focusing on maybe smaller minimum lot sizes, and allow, again, for a real sort of equitable split between the different housing types, but really making it more affordable and more attainable on the long run. I thought we had the most fun, though. The beans were a pretty standard exercise for us. I think the focus was along Route 1. Really looking for density where it's in close proximity to different services and existing facilities and infrastructure. There was some that sort of spread out sort of the northern end of town, but really work towards sort of nodes of transportation and sort of, as Tim had just mentioned, sort of existing density, and really felt like that was the right place for that. We had some really great time on sort of the variable impacts, in particular the transportation piece, and this is sort of a driver towards sort of the housing type, the type of housing development that we're looking for. So really taking advantage of our existing location within the two existing rail lines that we've got. So, advocating for sort of active transportation through the St. Lawrence and Atlantic, but also looking at the Pan Am line for light rail options to, again, facilitate additional ways for folks to get to and from Yarmouth, both to work and to live. We also talked about sort of increasing the number and the stops and frequency of the Breeze bus line. We talked about, again, extending out our current network of trails and connections between neighborhoods, so they're making it very accessible for folks of all transportation types. Some really great conversations on access to the airport, and finding better ways to connect folks from Yarmouth to fly to and from, and that spun into coordination with our neighbors and really being sort of regional thought leaders on how we can better make that connection for folks who live in and out of Yarmouth. Talked about ride shares and opportunities to condense the amount of trips on the roads currently, broadband development, a few other things that sort of were overarching to housing, but really kind of help to maybe facilitate the type that we're looking for. So thanks, and thank you for your work.
We talked some about looking at the senior and affordable category and kind of splitting that up, and we created this little band at the bottom that we sort of thought that everything 30% or so should be affordable, so of every category. But we really leaned into the single family concept, 40% multis, 20% ADUs. There was a good discussion around just having the freedom to have your own place, but have more rental options, more affordable options, so single family could be an option for us. And we really looked at the medium density residential zoning and sort of looked at the growth that's where we are already pretty dense, and changing some zoning laws might get us more growth in those areas. But really building around what's already walkable, what's already accessible, making sure that we're building energy efficient spaces and places. Let me see if I'm missing anything here. Keeping our quality of life. I think we all agree that we really enjoy living here, so it's really maintaining and making sure that our accessibility is great for everyone. And Just having more in Main Street that if we look at the housing and we make it denser within MDR, just making sure that the Main Street activities and businesses and small retail is there and growing, so that there are a lot of places that we can walk to. So thank you for your work, group.
So our group was more in line with Hildy. We were thinking 50% single family and then an additional 10% single family with ADUs. And then we kind of did 10% condos. I don't remember. We split it up. I didn't bring my thing up. But we broke it up beyond there to 10%. We kind of condensed some, but majority single family and single family with ADU. And the bean activity was really fun for us. We did a lot of back and forth. But we, again, focused on developing Route 1 and talked a lot about mixed-use space, so having commerce on the first floor with some rental units above it along Route 1. We talked about developing Main Street and having additional small businesses there that can draw people in when you're walking. You can walk to different small businesses, making Yarmouth more business-friendly, conserving open space, maintaining our walk and bikeability. We talked a lot about bike paths and making it a really safe community to get around in, because that's important to everybody. And I think, that's about it.
So our group also focused on single-family homes, but we also talked about the need for smaller single-family homes, such as cottages, style development, starter homes. We thought that would be a really important part of the housing here in town. We also kind of split 10% with duplex, 3 to 7 units, and condo and mixed use. Thought there's some opportunities in the Village District here. Little bit of ADUs, there were some concerns about those, and then we created a new category called innovative ideas, so really open-ended. I liked that. And then in terms of the beans exercise, we started off very slowly, a lot of conversation, but once someone put some beans down, it really blew up. So the same trends, Main Street, Route 1, Wyman Station came up as a big place, whether that's realistic or not, we're not sure. And then also a little bit out in the, I guess you'd call it north portion of town, like North Road, Granite, etc. Then in terms of ideas, we had some good conversations about the need for additional multi-use paths, pedestrian infrastructure for kids riding their bikes and adults alike, increased ridership or efficiencies with the Breeze service, because seems like that's being utilized or could be utilized really well. And that's about it, unless you guys think I missed anything, but I think that's good. Thanks.
I think the staff will be here for a little bit longer, but we're going to wrap up for the evening. So if there's any questions, feel free to pop up here and let me or Ben know if you have additional, or Jeff in the back if you have additional questions. But I really appreciate everyone spending 2 hours tonight with us. It is more than appreciated. And we hope that you continue the conversation online. Like I had mentioned when we started, we'll be duplicating a lot of the activities on planyarmouth.com so that you can add additional things that pop into your head tomorrow morning, or as you walk out the door and you're like, I really need to tell them this. We have avenues for that. And I also want to invite everyone to next Monday. We'll be talking about economy. So it will be a similar setup as this, with a presentation from Camoin Associates, a Q&A, and then similar activities, but all focused on growing our business community and the implications of that. So I think on behalf of the Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee, myself and North Star Planning, and Jeff, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And yeah, awesome. Thank you.